So this is the PowerPoint lecture for a US2 class, Chapter 17 on the Progressive Era from 1890 to 1920. This is a time of great political and social change. It'll culminate in women getting the right to vote. So women are a big part of this movement, and also look at the political situation as well. Theodore Roosevelt and the Square Deal, and Woodrow Wilson later on will also continue these ideas of the Progressive Era. In section 1, we're looking at the origins of progressivism, political, economic, and social change that leads to many progressive reforms. And politically, you're talking about more on the left, meaning more government involvement in people's lives, increase of taxes as well, also some changes for equality, demands for equality, especially in the area of gender equality. Now, the concerns of progressives come out of what was called the Gilded Age, and a lot of industrialization taking place in this country, and the idea of economic inequality taking place as well. So the progressive movement was middle-class reformers, people who had some time and money on their hands to deal with the problems of the 1890s as the turn of the century comes ahead. So their four main ideas are protecting social welfare, meaning taking care of people, promoting moral improvement, which leads to eventually prohibition, and creating economic reform. Again, federal income tax comes in play, but also fostering efficiency within businesses to make them more responsive to the needs of industry and demands that consumers put on the economy as well. The first area we'll look at is protecting social welfare. This starts with simple volunteers in the social gospel or settlement houses. Basically, when immigrants were coming in droves to this country in the 1890s and through the 1910s, many people needed a place to get some information. These settlement houses were exactly for them. Also, Florence Kelley was a political activist, and she advocated for women and children. This idea of prohibiting child labor, or at least child labor laws were put in place. Also, limiting the number of hours that women work was also considered an issue for social welfare. The moral improvement movement was basically the idea that the poor should help themselves, and prohibition was seen as an evil by many people, because, especially for women, because many men might drink a bit too much and come back home, and rather than pay the bills, but they were also beating their kids or their wives as well without any recourse. So alcohol was a problem. You see here in this picture the idea of using white, which means purity, for many women, and this was their way of kind of getting involved in social and political issues of their time. The other area is economic reform, the idea of can businesses really make whatever they want and just sell to the public without them knowing what's in it. That's a problem. Many people are also becoming socialists, believing that we should kind of even out the amount of money being made by those that are very wealthy and those who are left behind. So these muckrakers are an important term because they were journalists who exposed corruption in politics and business and the connection between the two. And it was important for them to kind of dig up the dirt, if you will, on business and on politics. The final fourth element of this is fostering efficiency, the idea of using social science, such as sociology, psychology, economic engineering, if you will. Scientific management was a term being used, time and motion studies, to actually see how many people can produce a certain product in a certain amount of time. This leads to the assembly line to speed up productions and make people work like machines. Of course, this causes higher order turnover and disillusionment with the way we were making things as a country. No longer did you have the skilled artisan making one product, but rather you had 10 people making the product much quicker and more efficiently, but also a bit mind-numbing and a bit ear-splitting in some cases for the factories that they worked in. Moving along, local government needed reforming, and there's a response at a local level to have government become more professional, rather than in the past where you'd have the party bosses and Democrats or Republicans who would be in charge of running the show for a town or a city. Now you'd have something called the council manager, which the town council might elect a city manager or town manager to run their town. And in Foxborough, indeed, that's what we have. We have the selectmen, board of selectmen, and they also have a town manager who runs the town. And things such as transit fares, corruption in utility companies were also issues being tackled in Detroit and Cleveland by some mayors at the time. But socialism was a real idea, the idea that people kind of being involved in the process and demanding change for the idea of equality and exposure of the problems that were taking place in the previous decades. A famous governor at the time, Robert La Follette, Fighting Bob as they called him, attacked big business. Not that he was anti-capitalist, he just thought that businesses left unchecked could just do whatever they want, and too much power and too much money being involved in that. So they want to regulate business. And regulation simply means government putting in rules to kind of make sure that business does things on the up and up. Again, protecting working children. You can't have reason businesses like hiring kids because, well, they were in some of these machines they worked with, their small hands could get things out pretty easily, but and they were less likely to unionize, so that was beneficial for the business owner. However, many people thought it was too young for kids to be working. An example of this, child labor laws being put into place. In 1890, we had about children working 16%, 18% that says there, and by 1930 it's down to 4.7%. You're talking ages 10 to 15, your age, or a little younger, I should say. And total number of children increases, but the number of children employed decreases in this time period. And where are the kids going? They're going to schools. That's what ends up happening. The public schools are created more or less during this time to keep kids in school, at least through 8th grade, and after that they can decide what they want to do. Some court cases limiting hours, the idea of a 5-day work week, an 8-hour day, comes out of this as well. Mueller versus Oregon, Bunting versus Oregon. Basically, the idea of a 10-hour workday was the first thing, but later 8 hours makes sense because it's 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for yourself. And the idea of compensation, workman's compensation, if you get hurt or maimed at work, you should be able to get some money in order to support your family while you're out of work. So this is at the state level as well. And finally, some reforming of elections, the idea of secret ballots, initiatives, referendums, recalls. These are all terms used in politics to kind of give more power to the people. An initiative is a bill proposed by people, not lawmakers, that's put on ballots. For example, there's a couple this year in our election. One to legalize marijuana, another one to expand charter schools. Those are initiatives. A referendum is a voters vote on an issue, whether an issue becomes a law or not the legislature. So now the referendum will be voted on in November, for example, on those issues. A recall is when voters take out an elected official through an early election. So back in 2003, we had supporters of recall of Governor Davis in California taking place, and in his place became Arnold Schwarzenegger, known as the Governator. So, and also primaries were allowing voters, not party machines, to choose candidates. We use the primary process as we have in our parties to select a presidential candidate, as happened this past spring and winter time for the 2016 election. And finally, direct election of senators. You might not know it, but each state has 2 senators, and they were not directly elected until the 17th Amendment was passed. And now this allows for popular election of senators. Before that, the state legislatures would select the 2 U.S. senators that would go to Washington every 6 years or so, depending when their time was up. So the 17th Amendment changes that. Now people elect the U.S. senators in this country. Now, women in public life, Section 2 deals with what issues that women were trying to focus on during the progressive period. Remember, this is all about change in a direction that wasn't there before. Again, women of middle upper class means devote their time to home and family, but also to these causes as well. Poor women usually didn't have the time for this to do so. As you can see in this picture here, we have women working in the factories, and you can see it doesn't look like a fun place to work. This is a hat company. It could be somewhere in Foxborough. The lighting is poor, the ventilation is poor, and they all kind of look the same. That's the idea as well. Okay? Farm women, southern Midwestern farm women the same roles as before, but they were seen as equals because out in the farm and out in the frontier, if you will, out west, they did many of the same things that men did. And so they were given equality in many states, especially for voting. The first state that becomes allows women to vote is in Wyoming. It's a population issue too. They want to make sure there are enough people to vote in order to become a state as well. So women were given the right to vote in some states, little by little. This becomes a national issue by the 1920s. Women in industry, only 1 in 5 hold jobs. Again, many men are working these jobs other than women. But ladies get to go to school for things like becoming bookkeepers or stenographers, which basically is writing down information that is said in a court case, and typists. So more or less work that you see for secretaries will be doing at this point in time. Domestic workers are simply maids, and there's plenty of those available to work for women as well, whether immigrants or black women as well. And they basically are allowed, that's their options for women back then in the turn of the century. And many female industrial workers seek to reform the conditions. They form cultural clubs and reform groups, and some become part of the higher education system. Not many, but there's also a movement of women not getting married. And at this point in time, if you went to college and you were a woman, you probably didn't get married. For chances are you might not get married. 50-50 chance of that. Here's a woman in 1923 going to a football game probably between Harvard and Princeton, and she kind of looks like the more modern woman of the time period. Women reformers target the workplace, housing, education, food, drugs. Okay, the National Association of Colored Women focus on child care and education, and the National Association of Women's Suffrage, led by Susan B. Anthony and some friends, to vote for suffrage or the right to vote. That was their goal. The strategy for women to get the right to vote was to convince state legislatures first to give women the right to vote. So if each state allows women to vote, then eventually the federal government will have to allow that too. They also want to test the 14th Amendment, which allows, if you can't deny men the right to vote, why should you deny women the right to vote? And finally, the constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote, which does happen by 1919. Here's a map that allowed women to vote out west first, some out in the Midwest, and no suffrage, specifically in the southern states, where they didn't think women should be seen as equals, I guess, politically speaking. In section 3, we look at the political system and what was going on. Teddy Roosevelt was a very influential president. We'll see his foreign policy later, but in domestic policy, he believed in the idea of a square deal, that people should be given help if needed help, but also to make sure that business continues to run and produce the products that people need. Now, he was a sickly child, was Teddy Roosevelt. He drives himself through athletics and also ambition. He's a New York politician, becomes a governor, but the people in New York didn't like him so much, they said, well, why don't you run for vice president? And he does. And basically, due to the assassination of William McKinley in 1900, shortly after becoming vice president, he becomes president. And he will serve almost 2 terms as our president in the early part of the 20th century. His leadership and publicity campaigns helped create the modern presidency, which means basically that the president can determine the agenda for our country. In this case, also the idea of a square deal, these progressive reforms that Roosevelt went out and spoke a lot about and brought his message to the people, using what's called a bully pulpit to get his points of view across. Rather than going to the press or to Congress, he went right to the people themselves. Very energetic guy. He drank like 40 cups of coffee a day as well. So interesting character, Mr. Roosevelt. One thing he thought was that monopolies, businesses that have basically something with Microsoft, who kind of has a monopoly on the computer industry, although Apple gives them a good run for their money, he wanted to break those up. Whether it was in steel, whether it was in railroads, or whether it was in coal, he thought that if there's too many monopolies, it's going to hurt the consumer. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to break up some of these monopolies. And he also showed his administrative skills by making sure that when there was a coal strike going on, that the workers wouldn't shut down the supply of coal that people needed for the wintertime. So he saw both sides of the issue, both labor and management, and what needed to be those situations. You push for railroad regulations, making sure that railroads have a set price for any products that are carried, no matter what or where they go. Distance might make a difference on the price, but also the weight should not make a difference. So both acts were passed to help that out. And one of the biggest things that they did, that the Roosevelt administration did, was to regulate food and drugs. In other words, you can't just get any kind of food that's made without knowing what the products are in it, and also to make sure that the meat people are eating is sanitary. So the Federal Meat Inspection Act was passed, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act are passed to stop the sale of contaminated food and medicine. And the idea of labeling what is in the product is something that's with us today. If you look at anything you buy, food and drink-wise, usually there's a list of items or ingredients that are in that food or drink, and drugs. Finally, one area that Roosevelt was very proud of was setting up the national park. Basically, the idea of protecting our national parks from being developed by private interests. So the word of conservation simply means to conserve that land that is in natural beauty as it is. So many state parks were set aside. This past month, they just celebrated the 100th year of the U.S. Forest Service, or Park Service. Many of them are out west because they have been touched. You have a couple out here, Acadia National Park of Maine, but most of them are out west and still beautiful places to see if you wish to go see them. On the civil rights issue, none of the progressive presidents, whether it's Roosevelt, whether it's Taft, or whether it's Wilson, really do a great job of dealing with civil rights issues. So as much as they might have talked a good game, they did not do much for black people during this time period. However, blacks themselves organized themselves. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, goal is for full equality among the races. And again, comes out the Niagara movement started by W.E.B. Du Bois, we spoke about in chapter 16, but also an educator and black rights leader in the United States. Now, Teddy Roosevelt could have run in 1908 for president, but says, no, I don't want to. He'd only serve one full term and another partial term, but he says, no, he'll leave it to his Vice President Taft, who will win the election in 1908 and continue these ideas of progressivism. He is not as energetic or as forthcoming as Roosevelt, and Roosevelt later on will regret supporting Taft, but he does do some things as far as being progressive and moving things along. Payne-Aldrich tariff, which basically moderates tariffs, and tariffs basically are something that should be kept low in the idea of progressives to promote free trade. Okay? And the idea of high tariffs means you buy more things that are within your country. Also, there was a issue within the conservation movement. The Interior Secretary was actually selling off land in order to basically get access to the Forest Service for personal interest, and this is our first real problem with the federal government being involved in this. And it was a bit of a scandal, and basically Gifford Pinchot testifies against this guy Richard Ballinger, who basically loses his job, and the first basically official to be fired in his job. Problems within the party. Republicans are split over Taft's support, and so Taft will not win again in 1912, and the Democrats, the opposition party, he is a Republican, is Taft. The Democrats controlled the Congress by 1910, and that's problematic to get anything passed if you are the opposite party as your president. So in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt decides to run against Taft, even though they were once running mates together. The Progressives formed the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party as it was called as well, to nominate Roosevelt. He will not win, but because he splits the Republicans between Taft and Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, will slide in as president in 1912, He is a reform governor of New Jersey. He is also progressive, so there's not much difference in the parties at this point in time, and things move along for progressives during this period of time. And the election in 1912 we see here on this chart. Eugene Debs, who actually was in prison at the time, he was a socialist he was in prison for his beliefs, but he won some votes. William Taft obviously does well. Roosevelt, but Wilson gets the most votes as well as the most electoral votes, which is the most important thing for winning a presidency. So you can see the split within the parties themselves. So now we move on to Wilson. He called his program the New Freedom, establishing a strong reform agenda as a progressive leader as well. His background is as a lawyer, professor. He's more of a thinking man. He's a president of Princeton first and then New Jersey governor. He focuses as a president on the trust, breaking up more trusts, the tariffs, and the high finance. There's a picture of Woodrow Wilson himself. You obviously will deal with World War I as well, but we'll look at that later on in another chapter. We're now looking at domestic issues. The Clayton Antitrust Act continues what happened on with the Sherman Antitrust Act, stopping companies from buying stock to form monopolies. He also forms a new watchdog agency within the federal government, the Federal Trade Commission. They're supposed to make sure that businesses are doing things on the up and up, and also ends injunctions against strikers unless threatened irreparable damage. It means basically strikers can strike unless it's considered a national emergency, such as the coal strike of 1902. A new tax system. In the end, the 16th Amendment is passed and the federal income tax is created. Gradual, meaning the more money you make, the more the government will take, and it has not stopped since then. Wilson also sets up the Federal Reserve System, a private banking system. Basically, it's the federal government giving money to banks when they need it. It's under federal control, but we have our nations divided into 12 districts. If you look at a $1 bill, you'll see a letter on there that tells you what city it was printed or at least made in, it comes from, and there are 12. It goes from letter A in Boston, all the way up to, I believe, letter L or so or K, I forget which one it is. But there are plenty of, it kind of also that divides up where our money is made. It's not made in all one place. And women in suffrage, college-educated women are spreading the suffrage message to the working class. They go to door, and also there's some tactics taken as well from British suffragists across the ocean. And in one case, a woman actually in England decided to throw herself into a horse race, literally throw herself onto the track, and was run over for it, and died from it, but the idea was to bring attention to the cause of suffrage, of the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt is the new head of Nassau that Susan B. Anthony has passed on, and she stresses organizing and lobbying. And by 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed, granting women the right to vote. So by the end of the Progressive Era, that kind of ends the Progressive Era itself. 30 years is a long time to keep a movement, sustainable movement, and also World War I, the outcome of that led to changes in our country towards a more conservative, right-wing kind of movement during the 1920s. Of course, Wilson, as I said before, was not very good with the civil rights movement. In fact, even though he favored civil rights during his campaigning, he did little to do that. He actually was a bit of a racist himself, as was pointed out in many historical documents. And so because of World War I, again, progressivism goes away for a bit. It will come back later on in the 30s and later on in the 60s as well. But for now, the 1920s will bring us back to another time period where it won't be as progressive, but rather more conservative time period in the 1920s. And that's it for now.